In the early days of the Vietnam War, amid a fierce battle for air superiority, an audacious plan was devised that would forever alter the course of aerial combat. The operation was a high-stakes gamble orchestrated by one of the most influential aviators of our time. It would see F-4 Phantom crews facing off against their Vietnamese foes, piloting the best aircraft of the communist arsenal. This is the story of Operation Bolo. The year was 1966. U.S. involvement in Vietnam was escalating, and control of the skies over North Vietnam was critical to maintaining the upper hand in the conflict. However, the U.S. Air Force faced a deadly challenge: North Vietnam's MiG-21 fish beds. Initially, the North Vietnamese were equipped only with the older MiG-17 Fresco, but by 1966, the Soviet Union had supplied the North with over a dozen brand new MiG-21s. The MiG-21, a sleek and fast Soviet-built jet, was designed for one purpose: to hunt down and destroy American bombers ranging from the lumbering B-52 to the swift but heavy F-105 Thundersheath. Bombing missions over North Vietnam, such as those in Operation Rolling Thunder, were plagued by MiG-21 attacks. The US bombers were vulnerable, and MiG pilots grew bolder, launching hit-and-run raids that took a heavy toll. By the end of Operation Rolling Thunder, the MiGs would contribute to over 900 American aircraft being shot down. Now, the solution at face value would be to bomb the shit out of MiG bases, but that wasn't feasible due to political ramifications. If America attacked a Vietnamese airbase and mistakenly, say, killed the Russian advisor, that could escalate the conflict between the two superpowers. At the end of the day, the only way to stop the MiG threat was to get them in the air. The US Air Force needed a new tactic, something that would draw the MiGs into the open and turn the tables on the North Vietnamese. In the sky, threats can come out of nowhere. Jets have Gucci tools like radar, data link, and RWR to keep them safe. But as a basement-dwelling YouTuber who's never actually been able to fly a fighter jet, I rely on Aura, this video's sponsor. With Aura, you get round-the-clock monitoring and rapid alerts for threats to your identity, finances, and data. Aura stays locked onto threats, intercepting and neutralizing them before they reach you. It's online security that's fast, fearless, and always watches your six. Check out Aura with the free link in the description below. You've got nothing to lose and security to gain. You can also sign up with the code Falcon's Fighter Tales for a free trial today. Don't take any chances with your online security. Trust Aura, the top gun of cybersecurity. Now, let's get back to the show. Enter Colonel Robin Olds, a World War II double ace and commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, better known as the Wolfpack. When he arrived in Southeast Asia, Colonel Olds was already a legend with a hell of a career to boot. If such a thing as aviation royalty were to exist, Robin Olds would have been a prince. His father, Captain Robert Olds, was an instructor pilot in France during the Great War and later became an aide to Billy Mitchell. As a child, the young Robin grew up at Langley Field, Virginia, right next door to Karl Spaatz, who would later become the first Air Force Chief of Staff. Robin was born into aviation, molded by it, and took his first flight in a biplane with his father at age 8. After graduating high school, Olds attended West Point until December 1941. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Olds was transferred to the Spartan School of Aeronautics for flight training. By May 1943, his flight schooling was complete, and his wings were pinned on by Hap Arnold himself. During World War II, the fighter pilot scored 13 kills in both the P-38 and P-51, making him a double ace. After the war, Olds became one of America's early jet pilots, transitioning to the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star in 1946. 2 years later, he even had stick time in the Gloucester Meteor as part of an exchange program with the RAF's No. 1 Squadron in 1948. While he missed Korea, Olds built up experience as a jet jockey throughout the 50s and 60s, commanding squadrons in England, Germany, and Libya. By September 1966, when he was assigned to UBON's 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, he became distressed at the lack of experience displayed by American pilots. The new generation of fighter pilots raised in the F-4 Phantom were rarely trained to engage anything more than level-flying bombers. 18 of the 8th had already been shot down in the past 6 months alone. The now Colonel Olds wanted to change that. When he arrived at Ubon, he gathered all the pilots, many half of his age, into the briefing room.
I'm the new guy. You know a lot that I don't know, and I'm here to learn from you. But in 2 or 3 weeks, I'm gonna be better than all of you. When I know more about your job than you do, you're in trouble.
For the next several months, Olds passed along his dogfighting prowess to his subordinates, using decades of experience to reinforce his fighter wing skill set. But how would they get the MiGs into a dogfight? The MiG-21s used guerrilla tactics, making slashing attacks at bombers before running for home. If a standard F-4 combat air patrol was spotted, there would be no sense in even trying to come out and play. That's when John J.B. Stone from the 555th Tactical Fighter Squadron came up with an idea to bait the MiGs. Olds dubbed the operation Bolo, named for the iconic Filipino fighting knife. The key to Operation Bolo was deception. Olds and his team would disguise their Phantoms as vulnerable F-105 Thunderchief bombers, the usual targets of MiG-21s. J.B. Stone would work closely with Robin in the mission planning. By flying the same formations, using the same radio calls, and even mimicking the flight paths of F-105s, Olds hoped to trick the MiGs into thinking they were attacking a bomber group. In addition to flying like a Thud, the Rhinos would also carry the QRC-160 electronic countermeasures pod, a device normally used for neutralizing surface-to-air missile radars. The pod, rarely carried on Phantom Cap flights, was generally fielded by bombers like the F-105 to offer some protection from the SA-2 Guideline and KS-19 search radars that plagued Vietnam. All in all, from the Vietnamese ground intercept control stations, the Phantoms would mimic well their heavier Thud counterparts. But the reality would be very different. Unlike the slower, bomb-laden Thunder Chiefs, the F-4 Phantoms were fast, more maneuverable, and packed air-to-air missiles. The day of reckoning came on January 2nd, 1967. The skies over North Vietnam were cloudy, and the MiGs, unaware of the trap that had been set, were eager for another chance to strike at American bombers. The Wolfpack's 28 Phantoms were broken up into flights of 4, each using a radio call sign named for a car brand. Vespa, Plymouth, Tempest, Lincoln, and Rambler flights were spearheaded by Ford and, of course, Olds' flight. The flights were staggered apart to maximize MiG killing time. At precisely 1500 hours, Olds' flight, led by Olds himself, flew a bombing mission profile toward Phu Quyen Airfield, a MiG-21 base. As the Phantoms approached, North Vietnamese radar picked them up. As the MiGs closed in, expecting to find slow, defenseless bombers, they were met with the shock of fully armed F-4s ready for battle. Olds' flight made first contact as a MiG-21 broke through the clouds at Robin's 6 o'clock low. Captain Everett Raspberry, Ford 3, tallied the incoming bandit and radioed a warning to Olds' flight.
Watch it, Colonel. Got a bandit crawling up your ass.
Olds' flight, break.
Breaking into 2 elements, the Phantoms split their formation up, leaving the MiG to pursue Olds and his wingman. Breaking back to defend his leader, Lieutenant Walter Redeker achieved a solid lock tone from one of his sidewinders.
Splash! Olds lead! You're clear!
Now clear of the threat, Colonel Olds spotted a pair of MiGs at his 11 o'clock. His wingman, Ralph Wetterhahn, ripple-fired a pair of Sparrows at the lead MiG.
He's down.
Olds bore down on his target, firing once, twice, and 3 times at the trailing MiG, but each one of his missiles failed him, allowing the MiG to escape into the cloud deck. He wouldn't be frustrated for too long, for a third MiG came into view, passing by on his left side. The flying ace lined up on the fishbed's tail, and a 4th missile ran towards it.
Box 2. Last one.
Good shot, Colonel.
Before he could get more kills, Olds was forced to break off when Redeker reported a fuel feed problem. No matter, Forward Flight was just catching up.
Let him have it, Chappie.
Forward Flight, led by Colonel Chappie James, a World War II Tuskegee airman, had already been fired upon by a battery of surface-to-air missiles on their run-in, but ironically enough, the ECM pods their Phantoms had been retrofitted with kept them safe. Every one of the guideline missiles shot past the flight and disappeared into the sky. Once again, Everett Raspberry's keen eye spotted an incoming MiG, this one bound for Forward Flight. Raz, unable to get forward lead to break with him, turned toward the attacking fighter. Finally, Chappie broke into the attacker himself, forcing the bandit to overshoot to the left. Raz's Sidewinder sang to him with a sweet melodic growl.
Fox 2. I got one.
Next came Rambler Flight, led by J.B. Stone, and in a mere moments, 3 more MiGs were obliterated.
Nice, fucker.
It was an absolute slaughter, leading the Vietnamese controllers to command the remaining fish beds to bug out into the clouds. When the dust settled, Operation Bolo was a resounding success. 7 MiG-21s, half of the Vietnamese fish bed fleet, were shot down in the span of just 12 minutes. Operation Bolo had not only reduced the threat from MiG-21s, but also shaken the confidence of the North Vietnamese Air Force. For months afterwards, their MiG pilots were hesitant to engage US aircraft, giving American bombers more freedom to operate. Operation Bolo has since become a legendary in the annals of air combat history. It was a tactical masterpiece, a perfect blend of deception, strategy, and raw power. Colonel Robin Olds, already a hero from World War II, became an icon once more in Vietnam. Operation Bolo is still studied today as an example of innovative leadership and tactical excellence. It's a reminder that, in war, sometimes the best weapon you have is your ability to outsmart your enemy. It did also highlight some of the shortcomings with American missilery in its infancy, as over half of the missiles fired in the engagement failed to hit their target. This would be an issue that would plague Air Force pilots throughout the war. While the Air Force would go on to struggle against the growing experience of their communist foes, Operation Bolo was a day of victory that is still celebrated as an Air Force legend. Of course, the operation cemented Robin Olds into Air Force history. That being said, he couldn't have accomplished the mission without a star-studded cast of squadron mates. Forward leader, Chappie James, would go on to become the first African-American 4-star general in the US Air Force, commanding NORAD in 1975. He would proudly serve until 1978, when he would pass away from a heart attack just 3 weeks after retiring. Everett Raspberry would leave Vietnam after fulfilling his 100-mission tour with 2 MiG kills under his belt. He would leave the Air Force in 1977 as a colonel and go on to work for Armament Systems Incorporated. He passed away in 2019. John J.B. Stone, one of the planners of the operation and Rambler Flight's lead, scored a MiG kill during the engagement. For his contributions to the Air Force, the Captain John Stone Award would be created in his name for outstanding mission planners at the Red Flag exercise. Robin Olds would continue to serve in Vietnam, claiming 4 MiG kills. When he finally retired in 1973, he had served for over 3 decades. He passed away peacefully in June 2007, but as the saying goes, legends never die. The 8th Fighter Wing still exists today. They're stationed at Kunsan Air Force Base in Korea, their F-16 sporting a bold WP on the tail for Wolfpack. Even now, the echoes of Operation Bolo are reflected in its pilots and their motto, Attack and Conquer. Thank you all for watching, and remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories like this one. A special thanks goes out to my Ace of Aces tier on Patreon who, as always, help me keep continuing this line of work. I really can't do it without you guys. Thanks to Captain Fantastic, Chuck45, Deuce, Ghoul, Iron, Jake Fuentes, Kodai, Chris Quinn, Pecops, Private Petey, Shockwave, Aspen, Tico, and Weavy. Keep that sun at your back, guys, and you have a good one. How are you and your men feeling about today's engagement?
Well, we came to play, and it all brings down to practice how you play. And my old football coach, Gary Sweatland, used to tell me back in little old Western New York, and just doing great work on this side of the planet. A lot of people like me are happy to be here and happy to be doing the things that we're doing. God bless America. Can I get a cigarette now?
We all deserve a drink. Let's wrap this up in the whiskey room. Wait, what the bloody hell are you doing here?
Hey, Papa Thrash, what's shaking?
How did you get past the dogs?
Yeah, the door was unlocked, so I figured I'd let myself in. Damn, this booze is peak.
That, you ungrateful colonial, is my last bottle of 21-year-old Glenfarclas. And wait, have you put bloody ginger ale in that? My God, I think I need to sit down.
Yo, I heard you talking about the meteor.
Oh God, here we go.
Well, it's a good occasion to bust it out. Good plane. Damned good plane. But
look, do we really have to?
The Brits weren't the only allies to get a jet working before the end of the war. Did you know?
There's literally nothing I can do to stop you at this point, is there?
We actually introduced the P-80 Shooting Star by the war's end, and that's exactly what we're diving into. The tale of the Shooting Star. The more I research it, the more I realize that American and British aviation went hand in hand in World War II. I'll be frank, without our friends across the pond, we wouldn't have had a decent power plant for our first real frontline jet. The P-80 Shooting Star was and still is an American icon, thanks to a little help from our friends. And you know what? It changed history. And it didn't just get its start in the post-war world. If you're not that deep into airplane lore, you're probably thinking, oh, Falcon, the P-80 wasn't a World War II jet. Well, actually, the Lockheed Shooting Star did see service before the end of the war. Buckle up, boys and girls. Today we're gazing upon the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first proper jet fighter. There's an idea held in the history crowd that America was far behind the Axis in jet design during World War II. While the Germans did field jets well before the end of the war, the US wasn't lagging far behind by any means. See, that's what happens when you actually have allies that are willing to share their progress. I covered this before, but as far back as 1939, the Lockheed Corporation headed by Kelly Johnson was actively developing the L-133. While the design itself didn't get off the drawing board for a number of reasons, elements of the 133 would be preserved and feature in Lockheed's next jet design, the L-140. Meanwhile, in 1942, the Bell Corporation was busy at work designing their own aircraft, the XP-59. The XP-59 was, to put it lightly, mid. While it was powered by two General Electric J-31s, the Komet, as it was called, could barely push past 400 miles an hour. In a fly-off against conventional piston aircraft like the P-47, the Komet was outclassed in almost every regime. It was decided that the 66 Komets produced would be relegated to training American pilots on subsequent jet designs. Meanwhile, the Lockheed Skunk Works team was on track for getting the L-140 ready for flight. The L-140, later designated XP-80, was powered by a Halford H-1 Goblin engine sent to the United States by our British friends. The XP-80 had a pretty conventional design, with straight wings and a tricycle landing gear which proved more effective for jet aircraft. It was composed, like many aircraft of the era, of aluminum and emphasized simplicity of production. It was wartime, and they had to be ready to crank these out by the thousands. Another important feature of the XP-80 was its bubble canopy, which was already seeing great success with other Allied fighters. The bubble canopy allowed for an unobstructed panoramic view around the pilot, a far cry from the XP-59's conventional canopy design from years past. On January 8, 1944, the XP-80, nicknamed Lulu Bell, was ready for its maiden flight. At Muroc Army Airfield in the high desert of California, the green jet taxied towards the runway, flanked by military officers and foreign dignitaries of the Allied powers. At the controls was Milo Garrett Burkham, Lockheed's chief test pilot. Slowly, Lulu Bell accelerated down the runway under the howl of its Goblin engine. In moments, it glided into the sky. It handled wonderfully as Burkham made several passes over the field at 4,000 feet, performing aileron rolls, low passes, and climbs almost straight up. On the ground, the famous Tex Johnson, who at the time was the chief test pilot for the P-59, stated, "I have never seen a crowd so excited since my barnstorming days." After the P-80 greased its landing back at Muroc, Johnson sent a wire to Robert Stanley, another Bell test pilot. Subsequent testing of the XP-80 saw it pass through 500 miles an hour, making it the fastest aircraft in the hands of the United States. While the XP-80 was sometimes called the Green Hornet for its spinach green paint scheme during development, it was soon officially dubbed the Shooting Star. Minor modifications to the airframe resulted in the YP-80, which was the prototype of the production model. General Harold Hap Arnold, who had been studying German jets in Europe, was primed to get a hold of the new American jet. When asked when he wanted to test the new fighter in combat, he simply replied, "Now." In November 1944, it was decided that a 4-ship of YP-80s were to be sent overseas, in a clandestine operation dubbed Extraversion. In the closing days of 1944, the 4 YP-80s had arrived in Europe for operational testing. 2 went to the 8th Air Force in England, while the other 2 were sent to the 12th Air Force in Italy. Instead of the green paint that trademarked Lulu Bell, the 4 operational P-80s were coated in a pearl gray scheme. The combat-ready Shooting Stars were armed with a cluster of 6 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, each packing 300 rounds of ammunition. It was a simple, tried and true loadout, as the machine guns had already been chewing up Axis aircraft throughout the war to this point. The pair bound for England arrived on December 30th, 1944, and were quickly assembled at RAF Burton Wood. The 2 aircraft, 44-83026 and 44-83027, were immediately put through their paces, but tragically, flaws in the early jets started to show. On January 28, 1945, Major Frederick Bersotti was killed when the Shooting Star's Allison J-33, an American-built version of the Goblin, overheated and burned through its casing. The tail section disintegrated and the plane crashed into a nearby farmland. The other YP-80, instead of being sent into combat, was instead sent to the Rolls-Royce factory for testing with the new Neen B-41 engine. It would not see any action during the war. The Shooting Stars sent to Italy saw a bit more success. 44-83028 and 44-83029 arrived in Lucena by January 1945, right around the time Allied forces started getting buzzed by the Arado 234 jet bomber. There's not really too much information available regarding the P-80's time in the 94th Fighter Squadron of World War I fame, and whether or not they were intended to counter the new threat directly. However, the 94th's photographer, Albert Bertiglio, supposedly witnessed a P-80 on a mysterious mission near Foggia, Italy. We'll likely never know what the goals of that particular mission were, but it's possible it was a combat air patrol, aimed at knocking down German jets. Supposedly, Major Ed Leclerc flew 2 such combat sorties, but didn't encounter any aircraft. Now, I'm not going to speculate too much on this, but if you know any more about extraversion operations from World War II, please let me know. It's been 80 years, so you probably won't get in trouble. Probably. Of the initial batch of 14 P-80s built in 1944, one was modified into a photo reconnaissance bird. The aircraft was dubbed F-14. Wait, what? No, not that one. So prior to 1947, photo recon aircraft were given the F designation, as the more sensible P was allocated to pursuit or fighter aircraft. I know, it was wacky by today's standards. In any case, the Sol F-14 was one of the first P-80s to crash when it was lost in a stateside crash in '44. That being said, early jets were just dangerous. Teething issues with engine fires were a huge problem, soon to be rectified with subsequent models. By July 1945, 83 P-80s have been delivered to the Army Air Corps. While an incredibly small number compared to their German and British counterparts, they would continue production all the way through the 1940s. By the end of their production cycle, over 1,700 examples were produced, and that's not even counting its long-lasting trainer variant, the T-33. The T-33 was a pretty straightforward adaptation of the P-80 into a training aircraft. The fuselage was extended to allow a second crewman, and the T-33 would arguably become more famous than its fighter counterpart. The T-33 took its first flight in 1948 and quickly became the backbone of the US Air Force's jet pilot training program. It would be exported worldwide and be used by the air forces of Bangladesh, Belgium, Bolivia, Brazil, Burma, Canada, Chile, the Republic of China, Colombia, Cuba, Denmark, the Dominican Republic, Ethiopia, Ecuador, El Salvador, France, West Germany, Greece, Guatemala, Honduras, Indonesia, Iran, Italy, Japan, Libya, Mexico, the Netherlands, Nicaragua, Norway, Pakistan, Paraguay, Peru, the Philippines, Portugal, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, South Korea, Spain, Thailand, Turkey, Uruguay, Yugoslavia, and of course, us. The friggin' thing would be used in a military capacity up until 2017 when Bolivia sent the last of their T-birds to pasture. In the end, 6,557 T-33s would be completed. Whew, I need another drink after that.
Oh, thank God, I thought you were never going to ask. Here.
Oh, thanks, bro.
That's Lord to you.
Hell, on that note, the T-33 was even adapted as a carrier trainer, the T-2V Sea Star. The Sea Star had a multitude of features added to allow for carrier use, not limited to strengthened landing gear, an improved bubble canopy, and a tailhook. But it didn't quite live up to what the Navy was looking for. The Allison J-33 was, well, less than ideal for carrier ops. It was renamed the T-1 after the 1962 Tri-Service designation came into play, and it was retired in the 1970s in favor of the more capable T-2 Buckeye. But let's circle back to the P-80 itself. While it missed seeing combat in World War II, it would soon draw blood over the skies of Korea. By 1950, when the United Nations became embroiled in the Korean conflict, the P-80 had seen a bit of a facelift. After 1947, when the US Air Force was formed, the P-80 was redesignated the F-80, F for fighter replacing the old P for pursuit. On that note, the old F-14 recon version was redesignated FP-80A. The redubbed F-80A was upgraded to the C model. The F-80C was given an upgraded Allison J-33-A35 engine that offered improved thrust and reliability, and a pair of fuel tanks were added to the wing tips to offer increased range. Another vital addition to the F-80C was an ejection seat. Early in the P-80's development, several pilots, including top-scoring American ace Dick Bong, were killed in low-altitude accidents. In Bong's case, his engine failed on him, and while he was able to bail out of the falling shooting star, his parachute sadly didn't deploy in time. While the first-generation F-80 catapult seat was far from a 0-0 seat, it did a good job of improving pilot survivability. The F-80C was also given a Sperry APG-30 radar range and gun sight. Previously, the P-80 was equipped with a gyroscopic lead computing gun sight that required the pilot to manually input the range to the target. With the addition of a rudimentary ranging radar in the nose, the F-80C could reliably lead targets at longer ranges while at the same time taking a load off the pilot. The same gun sight would also be employed on the F-80's successor, the F-86, but that's a story for another day. On November 8, 1950, a flight of shooting stars of the 16th Fighter Interceptor Squadron zipped through the cold Korean air near the Yalu River. In the flight was First Lieutenant Russell Brown. The Silverjets had already strafed a North Korean anti-aircraft battery near Sinanju when they were notified of a communist aircraft flight in the area. Within moments, 4 swept-wing jets bearing North Korean markings turned towards the shooting stars. These were not the older Yak-9s or LA-9s the Americans had regularly fought previously. These were the new MiG-15. The MiG-15 was the most advanced fighter in theater at the time and was almost 100 miles an hour faster than the World War II vintage F-80. Despite this, Brown was able to get behind one of the sleek fighters and unload his Browning 50 cals at it. The first official jet versus jet combat had commenced, and the F-80 flight claimed a kill on the MiGs. Now this is where things get a little muddy. As I've stated before, what's claimed versus what actually fireballs doesn't always line up. While Brown's guns may have struck home, their target, a MiG-15 flown by Senior Lieutenant Karidanov of the 72nd Guards Fighter Aviation Unit, made it back to base. This may have not been the first jet-on-jet engagement either, as another 72nd Guard pilot, a Lieutenant Kalmanich, supposedly claimed an F-80 a week earlier on November 1st, but that shooting star was reported destroyed by ground fire. Perhaps we'll never know for sure what exactly went down with these early jet engagements, but one thing was clear: the jet age had begun. The old shooting stars, outclassed by the new MiG-15s, were relegated to ground attack and close support missions, jobs that their straight wing designs did extremely well. Regardless, the shooting star was an obsolete plane by war's end, and all 10 of the F-80 squadrons in Korea had transitioned to either the F-86 Sabre or the F-84 Thunderjet by 1953. Still, they left their mark on history, and not without losses of their own. 277 F-80s were lost in the war, 113 to ground fire and 14 to enemy aircraft. That being said, they still claimed 17 kills over communist aircraft. The P-80 Shooting Star did well to leave its legacy as America's first operational jet fighter. It really could do everything. It had variants able to dogfight, perform ground attack, photo reconnaissance, forward air controlling, and was the backbone of pilot training for many nations deep into the 21st century. You can even find T-33 Shooting Stars in civilian hands today. Throughout the United States, over a dozen T-33s are kept in flying condition and perform in air shows around the country. If you're at the right place at the right time, you might get to see a show very similar to the one Tex witnessed 80 years ago, when Lulu Bell first took to the sky.
Yes, very interesting, very interesting. You are rapidly approaching the edge of the envelope of my patience, beyond which I assure you there is only darkness. Now get out.
Okay. If you're interested in supporting my shenanigans, please check out my Patreon. It helps keep videos like this come off the press and keeps me out of a cardboard box. I appreciate every single one of you. A special thanks goes out to my Ace of Aces tier on Patreon. You guys rock. Captain Fantastic, Deuce, Ghoul, Iron, Jake Fuentes, Kodai, Private Petey, Aspen, Tico, Weefy, Boats FG, Blake Storm Elite, Pecops, and our newcomer, Nebula Creates. Keep that sun at your back now, you hear?
Driving on up and let's cruise a while. Leave your worries far behind. You can hedge your bet on a clean Corvette to get you there right on time. Now if you're ready to dive into overdrive, baby, the green lights are on. It's like you're running away on some high octane. Every time she reaches fully blown, won't you take a ride on heavy metal? It's the only way that you can travel down that road. Satisfied on heavy metal. Baby, won't you ride until it explodes?
Just because something is the first of its kind doesn't mean that it was the best thing around. Not every new weapon is going to carry a Dreadnought effect, which is in reference to HMS Dreadnought, the first of its kind that revolutionized naval warfare. A great example of this is the ME-262, covered in depth by Lord Hardthrasher. As always, he did a great job breaking down the aircraft, and he highlights that while it may have been the first jet fighter used en masse, it didn't carry nearly the impact the Germans hoped it would have. Overall, it really was a failure. On that note, the 262 is just the tip of the iceberg, and I wanted to take my stab at some of the lesser-known German so-called wonder weapon aircraft. There's a commonality among the Wehraboo crowd, and for those of you who don't know what Wehraboo means, it's a term for someone who champions German engineering or leadership in World War II. As such, they are obsessed with hypothetical what-ifs. What if Germany had more Tiger tanks? What if the Reich fielded the STG-44 in 1941? What if the ME-262 was in combat earlier? What if Hitler was a competent leader? You get the idea. They basically fantasize about Nazi Germany winning the war, and in some cases feel the world would be better off for it. Well, yeah, a lot of them turn out to be thinly veiled Neos in one way or another. I know what you did in your Hearts of Iron 4 campaign, you can't fool me. The 262 was just the tip of the iceberg, as German scientists had almost a dozen other jet or rocket-propelled so-called super fighters in the works by war's end. Some flew, while others were relegated to artistic visions, yet they all had one thing in common. They all sucked. By 1944, the German Luftwaffe had an insane attrition rate. That year alone saw 7,000 aircraft being lost. February 20th to the 25th of that year saw what was known as Big Week, which was intended to break the back of the German aircraft industry in anticipation of Operation Overlord. In that week alone, the Army Air Corps and Royal Air Force claimed 600 aircraft destroyed. This left the Luftwaffe scrambling to find new, low-cost interceptors to shore up their numbers. Practically any asshole looking to put forward a fighter design was listened to, no matter how outlandish. One of the few last-ditch German interceptors actually implemented in decent numbers was the Me-163 Komet. By 1944, the Komet was already deep into development. A core figure in the Me-163's birth was Alexander Lippisch, a pioneer of delta wing and tailless aircraft designs. Lippisch had already worked on a series of experimental gliders with the goal of achieving a stable flight platform without a conventional tail. In 1939, his project, the DFS-194, caught the eyes of the German Air Ministry. The 194 was soon modified to accept a rocket motor intended for short, high-speed hops. The rocket motor was based off of the work of Helmuth Walter, who had been conducting work with hydrogen peroxide fuels. Now, these compounds made for a powerful rocket motor, but were extremely volatile. The Walter HWK-109-509 engine finalized for the Komet was powered by T-Stoff, hydrogen peroxide, and C-Stoff, which was a mix of hydrazine hydrate and methanol. All explosion risks aside, the fuels were notoriously dangerous to handle and would melt through human skin like a red-hot nickel ball. I'm not the brightest crayon on the box, but I sure as shit would not have wanted to have that cocktail of crap sitting inches behind me. It got better too. So most aircraft have wheeled landing gear to settle back onto a runway. Not the Komet. To save weight, the 163 had a pair of wheels that would be jettisoned after takeoff and a single ski would be extended for touchdown. If you had any of that fuel sloshing around and you landed too hard, you could kiss your crowd ass goodbye. Dangerous to the pilot from the aircraft aside, you were looking at a parabolic flight profile that would take the Komet to almost 40,000 feet. The plane would then dive down and attack Allied bombers with a pair of Mark 108 30mm cannons. After running out of gas, the Komet would become a glider, requiring the pilot to fly the stubby interceptor back to its airfield, all the while vulnerable to enemy fighters. So yeah, it was an extremely flawed concept. All in all, despite over 350 examples being built, the Komet only scored between 9 and 16 Allied aircraft kills depending on the source you're looking at. At the same time, 10 were reported to have been shot down by Allied aircraft, and 9 more of the Reich's dwindling pilot numbers were lost in accidents alone. One particularly gruesome fate fell upon Joseph Post, a 31-year-old ace for the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front transferred to the Komet program. On December 30th, 1943, his Komet cartwheeled after the detachable dolly wheels bounced off the ground and hit his plane. The Me-163's engine shut off automatically, and the glider's wing hit the ground. When his fellow pilots came upon the crash site, they bore witness to Post's right arm and cranium practically dissolved at a chemical level by the T-Stoff mixture that had ruptured from the fuel tanks. So much for 43 victories. Of course, the Komet wouldn't be the Reich's only attempt at a silver bullet, war-winning interceptor. The Bachem B-349 Natter was developed as a point defense rocket fighter to address the shortcomings of the Komet. In concept, it was a piloted surface-to-air missile that would launch vertically at an American bomber formation, let loose with a volley of R-4M rockets, then fall back to Earth after its fuel was consumed. The Natter was powered by a pair of solid rocket boosters which would be discarded before a liquid-fueled motor would take over. Once the fuel was expended, by now well over the bomber formation, the Natter's pilot would take over and make a gliding attack with its rocket package. Instead of landing, the plane would separate around the cockpit and let the pilot fall out and deliver himself to the ground under parachute. In theory, should the Natter under its own parachute land safely, it could then be retrofitted and reused. Such a flight profile negated the need for any runway facilities as well as the need to glide back home unpowered and thus become vulnerable to any Allied fighters. There was even a conceptualized version of the Natter not fitted with rockets, but a nose hardened with concrete to act as a flying ram. This naturally didn't get off the ground, no pun intended. On March 1st, 1945, the Natter was set for its first test flight. At the controls was Lothar Sieber, a young pilot who, prior to his test pilot career, flew the Arado AR-232. Upon launching from the rail, the stubby rocket plane was seen arcing vertically into a cloud layer, only for it to stall and slam into the ground at several hundred miles an hour. It's assumed Sieber was knocked unconscious during the violent launch and didn't have a chance. Now, Sieber was an experienced pilot, and the Natter was intended for use by teenagers right out of flight school. Given the violent characteristics of the rocket plane, the SS canceled the program and the remaining Natter prototypes are relegated to unmanned rocket testing. If anything, Sieber can be remembered as the first man to launch vertically under rocket power, 15 years before Yuri Gagarin would launch in Vostok 1, so there's that at least. What if I told you that the German Air Force developed a proper stealth flying wing fighter in 1944, and the end of the war was the only reason it was cheated out of its success? If you're smart, you'll know that I'm bullshitting you, because that's a well-known debunked myth. First off, flying wings were nothing new by the time the Horten brothers were developing the 229. Alphonse Pinard, a French engineer, drafted up concepts for what would be known as a flying wing all the way back in 1876, and British aviation pioneer J.W. Dunn had a series of working flying wing biplanes in the early 20th century. Walter and Reimar Horten, two German brothers with a knack for building gliders in the 30s, sought to create a flying wing of their own. The ultimate goal was to reduce as much drag as possible by removing the vertical tail and fuselage seen on most aircraft. As Hitler Youth members in the 1930s, they developed their first flying wing glider, the H-1. Into the war years, they refined their glider designs, and it was soon envisioned that a jet-powered variant would make a decent fighter. Allocated 500,000 Reichmarks by Hermann Goering, the brothers developed what would become the HO-229. Powered by the same temperamental UMO engines as the Me-262, the HO-229 was a completed prototype by December 1944. This wouldn't be a German prototype aircraft if it didn't end up crashing, however. On February 18, 1945, the sole complete HO-229 crashed. Details on why it crashed are scarce, but from what I can scrape together, one of the UMO engines failed, as they often did, sending the flying wing into a death spiral. Its pilot, Erwin Ziller, was killed on impact. Modern aviation enthusiasts have often claimed that the flying wing technology captured by the Germans were a direct influence on the modern B-2 Spirit. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Despite the 229 having a lower radar cross-section as a side effect of its flying wing design, stealth was never really a factor in its development, and it wasn't the only flying wing around in the 1940s. In the United States, legendary designer Jack Northrop was busy at work with his own flying wing prototypes, completely divorced from the Germans. The propeller-driven N9M family had been flying since 1942, though due to their own issues they never saw full production. The Northrop aircraft developments culminated in the XB-35 and YB-49 bombers, the latter of which had 9 examples ready for initial production by 1950, when they were ordered scrapped in favor of the more conventional B-47. The cancellation of the B-49 devastated Jack Northrop, who resigned from the company 2 years later. When the Northrop Company became involved in the stealth bomber program in the late 1970s, it was their previous line of flying wings they drew inspiration from. In 1980, after suffering a stroke that left him mute, Jack Northrop was visited by designers from the company he founded, with concepts for a flying wing stealth bomber. In the end, Jack knew his life's work wasn't forgotten, and would go on to shape aerial bomber designs of the future. It wasn't the German design that would shape the B-2, but a homegrown flying wing. During all of this, the sole surviving HO-229 lay in the Smithsonian, lacking wings and in a state of disrepair. It wasn't until 1983 that Reimar Horten wrote in a publication that he intended to coat the aircraft in a mixture of sawdust, charcoal, and glue to help lower its radar cross-section. A claim which had never been revealed to anyone prior. Not the Luftwaffe, not the Allied powers who captured him, no one. In my opinion, he was full of shit. Even if the compound would have absorbed radar waves, which it didn't, the 229 had a massive pair of engine intakes on each side of the cockpit. Exposed engines like these are almost impossible to hide from radar, which is why you see modern stealth aircraft ducking their intakes to hide their fan blades. The whole idea of the HO-229 being any form of stealth fighter is a pure Veribooism spawned in the 1980s by a failed aircraft designer looking to grasp at any fleeting clout he could in his elder years. It says a lot about you when not even Operation Paperclip wants to take you in. Reimar Horten attempted to design more flying wings for Argentina, such as the IA-38 cargo plane, but it only flew 4 times and it was shit-canned due to unsatisfactory results. Reimar would pass away in Argentina in 1994. His brother Walter would stay in Germany as a NATO general, passing away 4 years later. What the fuck? An honorable mention I want to go into is the Focke-Wulf Triebflügel. This was another radical design intended to operate free from airstrips. I wanted to touch on this paper-only design because while it was trying to address a real issue, it had all of the hallmarks of other failed German tech and really never would have worked. The aircraft would have likely been a nightmare for even experienced pilots to handle, let alone the 18-year-old cannon fodder manning the Luftwaffe by the late war period. The United States experimented with similar concepts in the post-war era like the Lockheed XFV Salmon and XFY Pogo. While the designs were intended for carrier use, the overall concept was similar. A vertically launched aircraft that would transition to forward flight after takeoff. They didn't get far in development for a multitude of reasons, but mainly, they were ridiculously hard to operate for even experienced test pilots. The idea of squadrons of Triebflugel ripping into American bomber formations and safely landing at their fields was always a pipe dream. Difficulties in operations aside, the ramjet technology was still in its infancy, and rockets would have been required to spin the jets fast enough to allow their ram air mechanisms to function properly. I don't even want to think about the ramifications of bailing out of the thing. The second Nazi Germany declared war on the world, they were doomed to fail. They lacked the resources, manpower, and organization necessary for such an undertaking. As I researched these German blunders, it became evident that they had a very different philosophy as opposed to the Allies. The Allies stuck with relatively conventional platforms, all the while improving on deficiencies they may have had. By war's end and through their powerful industrial might, they were cranking out mass numbers of the best pistoned aircraft of the war. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany kept shotgunning ideas for radical wonder weapon aircraft that were intended to outclass the mass numbers of Allied aircraft. Burning millions of Reichsmarks and questionable jet and rocket fighters took away from improvements to their conventional, albeit obsolete airframes, and with that came massive losses of experienced pilots they couldn't afford to lose. The Allies saw more value in taking their aces off the front line and using them to better educate trainees. So while the Axis had aces with higher kill counts, for every pilot scoring 100 plus kills before being killed themselves in test flight or combat, the Allies had dozens of well-trained pilots who would outlive them. By war's end, the Allies had their own jet fighters coming onto the scene. Planes like the Gloucester Meteor and YP-80 Shooting Star were safer and easier to operate than, for example, the Me-262 and were more capable. Now, that might be a good topic to tackle down the road in a video. But what if these German superfighters made it into service and, due to, say, a failed Normandy invasion, the war extended into 1946 or 1947? Oh, I'll show you what would have happened. We had actual wonder weapons. The Korean War was a battleground where old met new. Innovative jet fighters like the MiG-15 changed the face of air combat, seemingly turning piston-driven bombers into relics of the past overnight. One aircraft, however, a B-29 Superfortress of the 28th Bomb Squadron, would defy the communist MiG force not once, not twice, but 5 times. This is the story of Command Decision. By the time the Korean War broke out in 1950, the B-29 Superfortress was no stranger to battle. The infamous Boeing bomber saw its origins before World War II. In the early 1930s, the US Army Air Corps' primary bomber was the Martin B-10, America's first all-metal monoplane bomber. While innovative, the bomber lacked range, a severe drawback for War Plan Orange, the US military's contingency against the quickly growing Japanese Empire. War Plan Orange's 1933 revision saw the need to attack the Japanese home islands should a conflict break out. The revision required a bomber with the ability to cross thousands of miles of ocean, a task no existing bomber could accomplish. The B-10, for example, had a range of less than 700 miles. The US Army commenced the experimental bomber long-range competitions in 1934, which would later lead to the development of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the Douglas B-18 Bolo. In short, the Army wanted a bomber that could carry a 1-ton bomb load over 1,000 miles. A later competition upped the requirements to carry the 2,000-pound bomb load over 2,500 miles at a speed of 175 knots, or 200 miles per hour. This time, the Glenn L. Martin Company would propose the XB-16, a radical twin-boom design featuring pusher propellers. It was deemed too expensive to build and was shelved pretty quickly. Boeing would revise its B-17 design into the Model 294. While initially a B-17 derivative, it ended up being a different enough aircraft to warrant a new designation, XB-15. The massive bomber could haul over 4,000 pounds of bombs up to 3,100 miles, but was found to be underpowered and couldn't meet the 200 mile per hour minimum. When it became clear that the Air Corps would not purchase the B-15 en masse, the Boeing boys in Seattle went back to the drawing board. They developed a concept for a pressurized bomber based on the B-17 upon request of the Army, the Model 322. While the Army pulled out of the project, Boeing continued experimentation with the new concept with their own funds. By 1939, the Army revised their super bomber requirements even further. asking for a plane that could carry a 1-ton bomb load even further and faster than the prior requests. Forget 2,000 miles at 200 miles per hour, they practically doubled the request, requiring 400 miles per hour to reach out to over 5,000 miles. Luckily, due to lessons learned from the B-15 and the 322 concept, Boeing had a head start on the project. This, coupled with advances in engine technology such as the Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone, brought about Boeing's Model 345. Model 345 was an ambitious project, featuring 4 of the R3350 engines to lift the massive 75,000-pound bomber into the air. Advances in remote gun technology enabled the new Boeing to sport a dozen 50-caliber machine guns and remote turrets. Unlike in unpressurized bombers, the pressurized cabin required gunners to control the guns via remote sighting systems which could calculate lead and ranging for the remote-controlled turrets. 2 turrets were fitted to the top of the aircraft, 2 below, and 1 in the tail, which had a unique arrangement of twin 50-caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon. In theory, the new bomber could lift off with a maximum payload of 20,000 pounds, though in practice on long-range missions, it would typically carry around 5,000. The Air Corps was impressed with the design and designated the new bomber XB-29. As war raged in Europe, the Army ordered 250 B-29s in September 1941. They would soon be needed.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The Pearl Harbor attack of December 7, 1941 brought America into the Second World War, and overnight, war production surged in the United States. The initial order of B-29s increased to 1,500 units, well before the first prototype XB-29 would even have its first flight in September 42. While the duplex Cyclone suffered from overheating issues, the new bomber was extremely impressive and met every one of the Army Air Corps' desires. Initially conceptualized to hit targets in both Europe and the Pacific, the B-29 was relegated to the Pacific theater as it was the only bomber with the range to hit the Japanese mainland. The first B-29 bombing raid commenced on June 5, 1944. The first Superfortress attack took the 58th Air Division over Thailand, which had been allied with the Japanese. The 98 Plane Force, led by General Laverne Saunders, launched from India to strike rail yards in Bangkok. The strike had mixed results, as 21 of the bombers had to turn back due to teething issues with the duplex Cyclones, and the remaining 77 B-29s found the target obscured by cloud cover. The inclement weather resulted in only 18 bombs hitting their targets. On the return trip, 42 of the Superforts had to divert to other bases, but in the end, the raid ended up being a 2,271-mile round trip, the longest bombing mission of the war to that point. The B-29 quickly became an icon of the Pacific theater, operating from the tiny Pacific Island bases dotting the vast ocean. The bombers would continuously strike the Japanese home islands in 1944 and 45 with conventional and incendiary bombs, breaking the back of the empire. Now, contrary to popular belief, there was at least one B-29 mission over Europe. While it wasn't part of a bombing raid, YB-29 41-36963, nicknamed Hobo Queen, made a flight to St. Faith, England as part of a misinformation campaign against the Germans. The flight was intended to fool the Germans into thinking B-29s were to be stationed in the ETO as a B-17 replacement. More famously, however, were B-29s allocated to Silver Plate, the Army Air Corps' contributions to the Manhattan Project. Silver Plate B-29s were stripped of most of their defensive firepower and modified to carry the top-secret nuclear weapons intended for striking Japan. 17 Silver Plate B-29s were built, with 2 actually carrying out the atomic bomb strikes in mid-1945. Enola Gay dropped the first bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima on August 6th, followed by Boxcar dropping Fat Man on Nagasaki 3 days later. The 2 bombings would bring an end to the war and begin the nuclear age. At the forefront of any future atomic war would be the B-29. The fall of the Axis left 2 global superpowers standing. The United States and Soviet Union quickly fell into a Cold War, especially after the Soviets detonated their own atomic bomb in 1949. This was a new kind of conflict, with espionage and weapons development taking the place of a shooting war. The Soviet Union got their mitts on their own super bomber, a 1-to-1 copy of the B-29 in the form of the Tu-4 Bull. I definitely recommend checking out Paper Skies' video on the subject, it's absolutely fantastic. The newly formed US Air Force inherited the Army Air Corps' fleet of B-29s, which became the backbone of the Strategic Air Command of the late 1940s. As heavy bombers were to be the tool of choice for delivering a nuclear weapon, both sides went to work developing counters to the massive silver planes. The Soviet Union had begun developing jet aircraft after the Second World War with the introduction of the MiG-9 and Yak-15. While the MiG-9 was an incredible flop, the massive 57mm cannon in the nose made its purpose very clear to Western observers. It was a bomber killer. Again, go check out Paper Skies. He did a video on this one and it's great. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, it was the B-29 that once again found itself the premier bombing platform in the theater. Now, by 1950, the nuclear mission had been shifted to the newer B-36 Peacemaker and B-50 Superfortresses, which were essentially upgraded B-29s. The once largest bombers in the Air Force's inventory were reclassified as medium bombers and returned to their conventional bombing duties of the previous war. Now, initially, the high-flying B-29s bombed North Korean targets without much challenge, but that quickly changed when a new swept-wing fighter began to appear. It was the MiG-15, a newly developed Soviet fighter packing a trio of 23 and 37mm cannons. The fast, high-flying interceptors ripped into Superfortress formations, often piloted by seasoned Soviet and Chinese pilots, a far cry from the inexperienced Japanese pilots that had harassed B-29 crews in the previous war. MiGs would account for 16 B-29 kills during the Korean War, and were a constant threat to crews on bombing raids over the newly dubbed MiG Alley. One B-29 in particular would continuously spit in the face of the MiG threat. A silver and black Fort of the 28th Bomb Squadron, aircraft number 44-87657, nicknamed Command Decision. Captained by Donald Kovic, Command Decision set out on October 17, 1951 from Kadena Air Base in Japan. The 28th Bomb Squadron was set to strike targets in North Korea when they were jumped by a flight of MiG-15s. The right gunner, Private First Class Henry E. Rook, reportedly scored hits on two MiG-15s that made attack runs at Command Decision. Both fighters spewed smoke and fell over the Korean countryside. A third kill on the mission was also made by tail gunner Sergeant Merle A. Goff. 50 caliber rounds raked across the stubby swept-wing jet, sending it down in flames. 10 days later, on October 27th, Command Decision launched again to strike rail bridges in Sinanju, North Korea. Once again, the bombers of the 28th encountered MiG-15 sent to intercept them. The keen gunnery of Command Decision sent down two more MiGs. Now, in some of my research, details on the kills are rather scarce compared to some of the better recorded victories achieved by fighter pilots. Jokingly, according to Clyde Durham, who served as a gunner on Command Decision after the MiG kills, there was a popular story told in the squadron about the MiG victories. It was said that Captain Kovic and the crew were on a daylight mission when they spotted a MiG-15. They shot at 2 MiGs, claimed 3, got credit for 4, and painted 5 kills on Command Decision. Of course, this was said with tongue planted firmly in cheek. Observers outside the crew verified all 5 kills. Perhaps even more amazing was the fact that 3 of those 5 kills were scored on one mission, 2 by the right gunner and 1 by the tail gunner. It's not often that bombers are given an ace status, which is typically given to the pilot of a fighter, but the US Air Force elected to paint 5 MiG silhouettes under the B-29's cockpit. The 5 kills, in addition to flying 121 bombing missions, made Command Decision, arguably, the most famous B-29 of the Korean War. The crew of the bomber would go on to complete their tour without much incident, and Captain Kovic, later promoted to Major, would sign on for a second tour, this time as the 28th's operations officer. Throughout the course of the war, B-29s would go on to fly 21,000 sorties and drop an astounding 167,000 tons of bombs. Superfort crews would also claim 27 enemy aircraft kills total, but only Command Decision hit the magic number of 5. The Korean War would see the last combat operations of the B-29, which would be retired in 1954 to make way for more advanced jet bombers like the B-47. That being said, the B-50, which was the development of the B-29, would go on to serve into the 60s as a tanker as well as a weather reconnaissance role. If you count the Tu-4 Bull as part of the B-29's lineage, they would go on to serve the Soviet Union and the People's Liberation Army Air Force of China well into the Cold War. In fact, turboprop-equipped Tu-4s served with the Chinese as late as 1988. Likewise, the B-29's foe, the MiG-15, would see a lengthy career. Even after being pulled from frontline fighter use, it still served as a trainer throughout the Cold War, and some reports even suggest it's still in use by the North Koreans. As far as Command Decision herself goes, while the original airframe was scrapped, you can visit a replica of her cockpit at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. It's a fantastic display that allows visitors to walk through the tight corridors of a B-29. I definitely recommend checking it out. If you're interested in more Korean War legends, check out my video on Casey Jones, the mysterious communist ace who struck fear into American fighter pilots over MiG Alley. I also covered naval aviator Royce Williams, who stood up to 7 Soviet MiG-15s alone in his Panther. That's a hell of a story too. The links to these videos will be in the description. Thanks again to my patrons who enable my shenanigans. Through their support, I've been able to begin my 3rd year of video making. Getting out of a falling aircraft has been a challenge for aviators since the dawn of air combat. Initially, the tried and true method of escape was to dive out of a stricken aircraft. Such a task became increasingly difficult as aircraft speeds and service ceilings increased. Since the 1940s, a life-saving device has saved thousands of pilots. Today, we're taking a look into the history of the ejection seat. The idea of a powered ejection seat came during the Great War, where experimentation with primitive parachute technology highlighted the problem of the pilot actually getting out of the plane. While parachutes weren't adopted en masse by pilots as of 1916, the idea of preserving the pilot's life was already being experimented with. I did a video covering early parachute development, but one of the big problems with egressing a plane was the pilot impacting parts of the aircraft or the parachute being caught up in the tumbling crate itself. Early aircraft barely pushed past 100 miles an hour, but even then, if you had one of the rare parachutes of the day, it would still be akin to trying to climb out of a car window on the freeway. And please don't do that, by the way. The combination of wind blasts and G-forces were the main issues, and aircraft designer Everard Calthrop envisioned a concept of a seat that would effortlessly blast the pilot clear of their plane. A 1916 patent depicted a device that would eject the parachute via compressed air. The force of the deploying parachute would then pull the pilot free. Over a decade later, Anastase Dragomir, a Romanian inventor, created what he called a catapulted cabin. The device was designed to eject the pilot, his seat, and a parachute in one contained catapult system. Dragomir's device was first successfully tested on August 25, 1929, when it was fired from a Maurice Farman biplane over Paris. The ejection seat concept would remain a novelty going into the Second World War. As fighter planes flew faster and higher, however, the impetus of an ejection seat grew. British testing in the 1940s showed that conventional bailouts were almost impossible over 200 miles per hour, as the pilot could do little to even move against the torrential wind blast. During the course of the war, the Germans experimented with compressed air ejection seats. The first practical ejection seats were fitted to the Heinkel HE-280, an early jet design preceding the infamous Me-262. In January 1944, German test pilot Helmut Schenk became the first person to escape from an aircraft crash with an ejection seat, when he lost control of his HE-280 on an unpowered glide flight. As the war drew to a close and jet technology began to take center stage, ejection seats became a necessity. Forget a 200-mile-per-hour wind blast, planes were quickly passing through 500 miles per hour. The British Ministry of Defence approached the Martin Baker Company in 1944 to research ejection seats to be applied to the new jet aircraft fielded by the RAF. The Martin Baker Company was formed in 1934 by Sir James Martin and Captain Valentine Baker to design aircraft, but the company suffered a massive loss in 1942 when their lone MB-3 prototype crashed, killing Valentine. No longer aiming to build airplanes, James Martin pursued pilot escape systems, fueled by the loss of his friend and business partner. Martin devised a seat fired not by compressed air, but with an explosive charge that would allow the pilot to clear the stricken aircraft's tail. The first Martin Baker seat, the Mark I, was fitted to a Gloucester Meteor on January 20th, 1945, and successfully fired a dummy clear of the plane. 4 months later, on July 24th, 1945, Bernard Lynch repeated the stunt, using his own body as the test subject. The Mark I in the rear cockpit of the Meteor fired safely at 8,000 feet, and Lynch deployed his parachute without incident. Just to ensure his safe ejection wasn't a fluke, he'd repeat the process 30 more times. The Martin Baker seat was a viable escape system. Many British aircraft were soon fitted with the new tool, and in 1949, the ejection seat saved its first life. Pilot John Lancaster was a test pilot for the new Armstrong-Whitworth AW-52 when he experienced severe pitch oscillations in flight. Putting his life in Martin Baker's hands, he gripped the ring pole above his head and was blown clear of the departed aircraft. The first real-world emergency in which a Martin Baker seat was needed resulted in Lancaster safely descending in his parachute after unbuckling himself from the fired seat. Over the years, and with various improvements, the Martin Baker seats proliferated across the world, being fitted to countless Western aircraft. The Cold War era saw rapid advancements in ejection seat technology, spurred by the development of supersonic interceptors. Hitting supersonic wind blasts after ejection could subject pilots to over 40 Gs as experienced by F-100 pilot George Franklin Smith. Smith was flying off Laguna Beach, California at 35,000 feet when his controls locked up. As it slipped past Mach 1, the Hun experienced Mach tuck, a normal phenomena involving the nose dipping. Now in an uncontrolled dive and his controls unresponsive, Smith elected to eject at Mach 1.05. The seat successfully fired, but the violent wind blast immediately began to slow his unaerodynamic body down. Hemorrhages turned the whites of his eyes beet red, and his intestines were lodged against his pelvis. Almost immediately, he lost consciousness. Luckily, ejection seat technology included the advent of automatically deploying parachutes by this point. As it unfurled, the high speed ripped almost a third of the canopy away. The limp, lifeless body of George Smith would have been lost to the sea if it hadn't been for a stroke of luck. A small fishing boat, the Balabas. The crew of the Balabas spotted the parachute and immediately sailed to the pilot to rescue him. He was then transferred to a Coast Guard vessel for treatment. Despite the horrific event, George Smith had become the first survivor of a supersonic ejection, a new, terrifying environment in the world of aviation. To counter the dangers of high-speed ejection, the US Air Force developed specialized escape capsules for their upcoming supersonic bombers like the B-58 Hustler and XB-70 Valkyrie. The F-111 Aardvark was also equipped with an escape capsule for its two crewmen sitting side by side. In the event of an emergency, the capsule would separate via rockets and deploy parachutes for the crew inside. Airbags would also deploy to cushion the landing. If the ejection was over water, the cockpit section was even buoyant enough to float as a makeshift lifeboat. It was a remarkable system, but capsule escape systems have since been replaced in favor of improved seats and crew equipment better designed to handle high-speed ejections. Capsules were heavy, expensive, and less effective at lower altitude, which brings me to the other end of the spectrum. Low and slow speed ejections had often been a surefire way to get killed in an emergency. Early seats launching with explosive catapults didn't really have the smash to throw a pilot high enough from a static or slow aircraft at low altitude. This became a severe problem for early Navy jets, which were required to fly on the knife's edge of their underpowered engines when coming back in for landing on a pitching deck. If a Navy plane were to go into the drink, it was extremely difficult to get out of the rapidly sinking aircraft. At first, ejecting underwater was thought unthinkable and sounds like an absolute nightmare scenario if you ask me. And believe it or not, it's happened. Royal Navy aviator Bruce McFarlane was one of the few pilots to eject underwater and live to tell the tale. McFarlane was the pilot of a Westland Wyvern, a propeller-driven aircraft equipped with an ejection seat. The Wyvern was a decent aircraft, but had a flaw in its Armstrong-Siddeley Python engine. When launched from a catapult, the high G-forces involved in the cat stroke often caused fuel starvation and stopped the engine. The unpowered Wyverns found themselves going right off the deck into the water. That's exactly what McFarlane experienced on October 13, 1954, when he launched from HMS Albion. After landing in the water, he was unable to exit the craft before the Albion's hull severed the Wyvern in two and drove it underwater. As his craft sank deeper, McFarlane pulled the ejection handle on his Martin Baker Mark I and was fired out under Albion's hull. He barely untangled himself from the web of his parachute lines as the carrier passed above him, and he was able to clamber to the surface. The feat was surprising to the Martin Baker team, who never expected their seat would work in such conditions. By the late 1950s, training films were created by the US Navy to instruct pilots to actually wait to eject until they were fully submerged. If they were to eject on the surface, there wouldn't be enough time for the parachute to deploy before hitting the concrete like water. Once again, Martin Baker came through with a solution. Instead of just increasing the size of the single explosive charge, which would cause severe spinal injuries, Martin Baker began fitting multiple charges in a sequence in their Mark V seat, which was designed specifically for naval aircraft. The Mark V saw use in aircraft like the A-6 Intruder, F-11 Tiger, and the F-8 Crusader. The seat could deliver an aviator under parachute as long as the aircraft was moving at least 60 miles an hour, even at ground level. A true 0-0 capability seat was always desired though, an ejection seat which would work with no speed and no altitude, as if the aircraft were still sitting on the ramp. Probably the most iconic Martin Baker ejection seat was developed with a rocket-assisted ejection package in the 1960s, the Mark VII. The Mark VII was Martin Baker's first true 0-0 seat. It was fitted en masse to Germany's F-104G fleet to cut down on pilot fatalities that often occurred at low speed during low-altitude attacks. Fitted to newer generation aircraft like the F-4 Phantom, F-14 Tomcat, and even the EA-6B Prowler, the Mark VII has saved over 1,900 aircrew from various accidents. The Mark VII is still in use in active Phantoms around the world like the Turkish Air Force's Terminator 2020 variant, which is expected to stick around until at least 2030. Those who have ejected from a Martin Baker seat are inducted into a special club known as the Tie Club. Since the 1950s, the Martin Baker Company has presented a special certificate and necktie to those who have bailed out in one of the company's seats. It's a tradition that has persisted for almost 70 years and continues today with over 7,000 Tie Club members, and thus, over 7,000 lives saved by the eponymous ejection seats. Until now, we focused primarily on Western seats, but I think it's worth touching on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union developed ejection seats of their own. The first seat-equipped Soviet aircraft was the MiG-15, which featured the KK-1. The KK-1 ejection seat, from what I could find, was pretty similar in capabilities to the Mark I and the North American F-86 seat. As a first-generation ejection seat, it merely fired an explosive charge to catapult the pilot and parachute out of the aircraft. Once in a freefall, it was the pilot's responsibility to free himself from the seat and pull his parachute. The MiG-17 and early MiG-21s used a canopy capsule seat, which involved the canopy hinging off its mount and connecting to the seat itself to create a sort of high-speed ejection capsule. These were clearly far from the 0-0 seats that would come later, and one of the most common Soviet ejection seats of the day, the KM-1, was notorious for causing severe back injuries. Back injuries were and still are common during violent ejections. However, there's something to be said about the KM-1 when Soviet pilots would apparently tend to try and crash land their MiGs rather than attempt an ejection. The Soviets would eventually get their own 0-0 seat in the form of the KYA-1M ejection seat. This notable Soviet ejection system was within the Yak-38 Forger. Being a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, the Forger required a 0-0 ejection seat since it was expected to stop in midair for takeoff and landing. The system was unique in that it was designed to automatically fire the pilot out if the Forger rotated 60 degrees or more when in hover mode. Another notable system is the Zvezda K-36 series, used primarily on their 4th generation fighters like the MiG-29 and Su-27. The 0-0 label was proven in 1975 when a Su-24 navigator of the 63rd Bomber Regiment accidentally punched himself out on the ground, which makes it the first successful 0-0 ejection ever outside of testing. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, check out Paper Skies for this one. Overall, the K-36 is a well-made seat, comparing well to the American Aces II seat, which is used in planes like the F-15, 16, and 22. In a 1996 DTIC report comparing the K-36D with the Aces II, the K-36D performed remarkably well. According to the report, the K-36 ejection seat accelerations at 729 knots were similar to those measured on the Aces II and NACE's seats at about 450 knots. A big concern regarding the K-36, however, were high G-loads applied to the head and neck during canopy opening, and the positioning of leg restraints resulted for the potential in extreme lower leg torsion upon C-firing. Ouch. The study also found that the time required to develop a fully inflated parachute is longer for the K-36 than the Aces II. It's definitely worth reading the study, which will be in the links below. It's an interesting comparison between the two different philosophies in ejection seat design. Modern ejection seats incorporate cutting-edge materials, advanced computer systems, and enhances the life support features. The latest designs, such as the Martin Baker Mark 16 and the Aces 5, utilize sensors that assess the pilot's position and automatically adjust the ejection sequence for optimal survival. These seats can accommodate a wider range of body types and ensure safer ejections even in extreme flight conditions. Just this past month, an F-35A pilot bailed out over Eielson Air Force Base in his Martin Baker US-16E after suffering an undisclosed problem. The investigation is still ongoing as of this video's release, but give it a year or two. From the early compressed air designs of the 1940s to the sophisticated rocket seats of today, ejection technology continues to evolve in response to the demands of modern combat. As aircraft continue to push the envelope, innovations in seat technology will remain a vital aspect of pilot survival and aviation engineering. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I want to give a special shout out to my patrons, especially my Ace of Aces tier. Special shout outs go to Captain Fantastic, Shuck45, Deuce, Ghoul, Iron, Jake Fuentes, Kodai, Peck Ops, Private Petey, Aspen, Tico, Weethy, Boats FG, and Blake. Keep that sun at your back now, gang. Have a good one. The F-14 Tomcat is one of the most studied and talked about planes in the world. There are some very well-versed videos out there covering the hard details of the Tomcat's capabilities and engineering accomplishments, but I really want to look into what made it such a cultural icon. Today, we're looking into the origins and impact of the F-14 Tomcat, the most famous fighter in history. To really grasp the importance of why the Tomcat was such an important aviation icon, we have to dial the clock back to its origins. The story began with an ambitious but ultimately flawed predecessor, the F-111B. In the early 1960s, the US Department of Defense, under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, sought to develop a common fighter for both the Air Force and the Navy. This initiative, known as the Tactical Fighter Experimental or TFX program, aimed to reduce costs and increase efficiency by creating a single airframe that could meet the demands of both services. In the 1960s, there was an issue regarding landing speeds for military aircraft. Prior to World War II, planes were equipped with straight wings which offered tight turning and slow, manageable landing speeds. Straight wings run into the problem of inhibiting high speed, however. If you were to try to approach, say, the speed of sound, a straight wing is effectively a barn door on your plane. German aerospace engineer Adolf Bussmann discovered in the 1930s that sweeping the wing back would cut down on drag, thus allowing higher speeds. Throughout the 1950s, you began to see a plethora of tactical aircraft equipped with swept wings. But with the swept wing comes a reduction in low-speed handling. The F-100 Super Sabre in particular was a nightmare to handle when flying slow. Something you need for, landing. As a result, landing speeds increased, and with that comes the need to extend runways out. For the US Air Force, this wasn't too much of a problem, but you can only extend an aircraft carrier deck so far. Even the new Forrestal-class aircraft carriers were challenging boats to land for FJ Fury and F-7U Cutlass pilots, the latter of which had an especially poor power plant coupled with poor low-speed handling. The Cutlass was quickly branded the Ensign Eater or Ensign Eliminator depending on who you talk to. A few years later, to get back to the TFX program, the designers would have to design an aircraft with good low-speed and high-speed handling to cover all theaters of operation it would be in. The solution came in the form of variable geometry. Basically, a hinged wing that would sweep back for high speed and straighten out for low speed. The resulting aircraft, the F-111, was designed as a supersonic, variable sweep wing aircraft that was capable of multiple roles, including long-range interception for the Navy. The Air Force's F-111 variants would go on to be damn good bombers, serving for almost 40 years. While it never received an official nickname, it was commonly referred to as the Aardvark. Another prominent and rarely covered variant was the EF-111 Raven, nicknamed the Sparkvark. This was a vital electronic warfare asset that jammed the hell out of Iraqi SAM radars during the Gulf War. All in all, great plane. Australia only just retired theirs pretty recently in 2010. Oh god. 2010 was 15 years ago. The Navy's variant, the F-111B, was intended to provide fleet defense with advanced radar systems and long-range missiles. I talked about this a bit in my F-4 video, but the F-111B's job was going to be a far cry from the dogfighting carrier fighters of World War II. After the Second World War, the clear and primary threats to a carrier task force were maritime patrol bombers like the Tu-95 Bear or Tu-16 Badger. Sure, they could carry bombs, but their real manner of attacking an American carrier would be long-range anti-ship missiles. Over time, the anti-ship missiles evolved from simple Mach 2 designs like the AS-3 Kangaroo to the long-range Mach 3 capable AS-4 Kitchen. The F-111B's duty would be to engage the bombers as well as any already launched cruise missiles before the fleet could be hit. For this, a pair of Pratt & Whitney TF-30 turbofans would drive the interceptor to Mach 2 at an altitude of above 50,000 feet. Once aloft, the B would search out an enemy formation with a powerful AUG-9 radar suite and lob the massive AIM-54 Phoenix missile up to 80 miles away. The AUG-9 was an absolute powerhouse of a radar. The radar and its partner in crime, the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, had risen from the ashes of the ASG-18 and AIM-47 Super Falcon, designed for the ill-fated F-108 Rapier and YF-12 Blackbird. While the Air Force initially passed on the expensive and complex system, the Navy saw it as a great fleet defense tool for the F-111B. The AUG-9 had a ridiculous range for the day, and in ideal conditions could track 24 air contacts at over 200 miles. The brain and heart of the F-111B were excellent, but the body would be its downfall. Despite the swing wing offering better low-speed handling, the F-111B was just way too heavy to operate effectively from aircraft carriers. Visibility was also an issue as the pilot couldn't see too well over the nose, something you really need to have a handle on if you're taxiing on a pitching deck. By 1968, the program had become a political and financial quagmire. Mounting cost and technical setbacks, combined with pressure from the Navy, led to the cancellation of the F-111B. It seemed a true inter-service fighter design would have to wait a few decades. The failure of the F-111B highlighted the need for a dedicated naval fighter. The Navy launched the Naval Fighter Experimental, or VFX, program in 1968. The new fighter needed to be capable of fleet defense, but also had a dogfight up close. The experiences from Vietnam showed that close-in knife fights were far from over, and the Soviet Union was developing a new generation of fighters that would surely escort their bombers. Ling Temco Vought, General Dynamics, Republic, and McDonnell Douglas all submitted proposals for the VFX program, but one company would stand out among the rest. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation emerged as the frontrunner of the competition, leveraging its extensive experience in naval aviation. Grumman's 303 design promised to address the shortcomings of the F-111B. The company incorporated advanced features, reused the AUG-9 and Phoenix combination, and the variable geometry concept along with the TF-30 engine. Design 303 would save weight by carrying the Phoenix missiles not in an internal weapons bay, but in a so-called gutter running between the two TF-30s. Initially, the design was to have a single vertical stabilizer, but a second was incorporated to improve lateral stability as well as allow the tails to be shorter than a single large design. Gotta save on that carrier hangar space. In addition to the Phoenix, the Tomcat could carry the standard array of Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles. Finally, the M61 Vulcan cannon was fitted to the port side of the nose if all other options were expended. The Navy awarded Grumman the contract in January 1969, and the designation of the new fighter was finalized as F-14. As tradition for all Grumman fighters, the F-14 was named for a cat, this time referencing the VFX project manager, Admiral Tom Connolly. Thus was born the Tomcat. On December 21st, 1970, the first F-14A prototype took to the skies from Grumman's facility in Calverton, New York. Early test flights revealed areas for improvement, but they also validated key aspects of the design, such as the variable sweep wings and avionics systems. Grumman conducted extensive testing to ensure the F-14 met the Navy's rigorous requirements. Carrier trials proved the Tomcat's ability to operate from aircraft carriers, addressing a critical shortcoming of the F-111B. VF-1 Wolfpack and VF-2 Bounty Hunters were established on October 14, 1972 at Naval Air Station Miramar, California, specifically to operate the new F-14. The two squadrons began training in the aircraft in late 1973, focusing on mastering the Tomcat's complex systems, such as the AN AUG-9 radar and AIM-54 Phoenix. By 1974, VF-1 and 2 were declared operational and prepared for their first deployment on the USS Enterprise. Many don't know this, but the F-14 did fly over the skies of Vietnam. The F-14 saw its first operational deployment during Operation Frequent Wind, the final phase of the evacuation of Saigon in April 1975. As North Vietnamese forces closed in on the city, the US orchestrated a massive evacuation effort to extract American personnel and at-risk Vietnamese citizens. The F-14 played a critical role in providing air cover for the operation. Operating from the Enterprise, Tomcats patrolled the skies, ensuring the safety of helicopters ferrying refugees from Saigon to US Navy ships in the South China Sea. The F-14's long-range radar and weapon systems proved invaluable in maintaining situational awareness and deterring potential threats, although no direct engagements occurred during the operation. Now, there are reports of the Tomcats tangling with the North Vietnamese MiGs and making strafing runs against the communist forces, but none that I've read have been substantiated. Regardless, frequent wind demonstrated the F-14's value as a fleet defense aircraft. Throughout the Cold War and into the 1990s, the Tomcat became a symbol of American military power in more ways than one. Even outside of the US, it appeared in anime such as Area 88 and Crystal Triangle, and inspired the VF-1 Valkyrie from Macross. Countless video games like Afterburner and Ace Combat featured the F-14 prominently, and oh my god, there were a lot of toys made of it. Die-cast toys, model kits, and the Sky Striker from G.I. Joe lined Sears catalogs for years. You couldn't walk into a Sears or Kmart without running into a Tomcat toy or book back in the day. Like, I cannot express to you how prevalent this thing was in both physical and visual media. This wouldn't be an F-14 video without delving into the Tomcats on the big screen. The first feature film to show off the Navy's new super fighter was The Final Countdown, released back in 1980. The movie centered around the USS Nimitz nuclear supercarrier being teleported back in time to the days leading up to December 7th, 1941. Now, the movie is really a means for the US Navy to show off all of its toys, and it's definitely worth a watch to see VF-84 Tomcats tangling with T-6 techs, A6M-0s. That's what they are. The F-14's ultimate starring role, however, came in 1986 when Paramount released the Holy Scripture Top Gun. And what can I say? It's a perfect movie. Now, you might be thinking, oh, Falcon, that's subjective. Well, it's my show, and my opinion on Top Gun is objectively correct. Real talk, though. Never before had aerial photography captured aviation in such a visceral manner. Overall, the movie has plenty of inaccuracies for the sake of storytelling, like the Top Gun trophy being a thing, and the aircraft fly in an extremely bunched up manner. Things like that aside, though, the movie does a really decent job of capturing what flying a Tomcat was like. And of course, we're gonna get to this part. Notably, there's a scene in the movie involving a double compressor stall resulting in Maverick's F-14 departing into a flat spin. Now, the accident featured in that film was a problem that several Tomcat crews found themselves in. Let's just have an aside and talk about some of the spin aspects of the Tomcat that everyone likes to latch onto. In my opinion, the TF-30 engines on their own get a bad rap. They were made for the F-111, which had a flight profile that was, for a lack of a better term, pretty straight and fast. In most regimes, the engines performed fine. When put into a Tomcat that was banking and skidding across the sky, however, they did have a tendency to stall when airflow was disturbed. In simple terms, a stall is when the engine chokes on an airflow disturbance. While rare, a stall can result in the engine completely shutting down or even cause damage to the internals. The problem with the TF-30s and the Tomcat is that even a minor stall can cause asymmetric thrust. The engine running well is going to push the plane faster on one side than the stalling engine. This causes a side slip, and in extreme conditions could cause the pilot to lose control. The Tomcat doesn't just get lift from its wings alone, as the fuselage itself supplies 20% of the lift. This is, again, in layman's terms, but if the Tomcat were to depart in a lateral motion, the airframe would almost act as a giant frisbee, disallowing air to flow over the flight surfaces and further choking the TF-30 engines. If the departure gets even more severe, the F-14 could fall into a flat spin, which was pretty much unrecoverable if severe enough. Part of the problem in a spin is that the crew and the nose of the airplane were outside the center of rotation. So they would be thrust forward in their restraints, and the pilot would have a hell of a time even keeping a hold of the stick, let alone stay conscious in a negative 7G situation. Throughout the Tomcat's service life, spin's attributed to 40 aircraft losses. There are some online circles that suggest sweeping the wings would shift the center of gravity back and allow the nose to drop, but according to Victory 205, an actual F-14 pilot, no such techniques were ever actually employed in the fleet. So yes, flat spins in F-14s are terrifying. So terrifying, in fact, that the US Navy emphasized training pilots to recover the Tomcat before developing a flat spin. The 1992 NATOPS manual merely says the following for a fully developed flat spin below 10,000 feet. Eject. In the mid-80s, Tomcat crews had focused training on how to avoid spins altogether. When getting the Tomcat into a high angle of attack situation, it has a tendency to have adverse roll effects. In some situations, when a pilot were to, say, crank the stick to the right, the Tomcat would roll left and exacerbate an already terse flying situation. Knowing this and adding a few other tricks, Tomcat crews quickly picked up the skills needed to avoid getting into flat spins to begin with. Faults with the TF-30 aside, the F-14 was still a force to be reckoned with. In the coming months, we'll delve into some of the highlights of the F-14's career, spanning from the dogfights over the Gulf of Sidra to the bombcat strikes in Bosnia. I also hope to delve into some of the improvements to the airframe, from the addition of modern avionics to the replacement of the TF-30 with the mighty GE F-110 turbofans. Hell, some Iranian Tomcats might even make a cameo. Stay tuned and subscribe, we've got some Tomcat legends coming up, guys. Thanks again to my patrons who enabled me to keep making these videos. You guys really are awesome, and I want to make a special thanks to my Ace of Aces tier. Shoutouts to Captain Fantastic, Chuck45, Deuce, Ghoul, Iron, Jake Fuentes, Kodai, Private Petey, Aspen, Tico, Weefy, Boats FG, and Blake Storm Elite. You guys are the bomb, and keep that sun at your back. Last time, we took a look at the birth of the F-14 Tomcat and the vice grip it had on the media of its day. Of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The evolution of the aircraft is just as, if not more interesting than the circumstances surrounding its birth. From the addition of a long-range television camera to the installation of improved engines, we're taking a peek at the evolution of the F-14. The initial variant of the F-14, the A model, was a hell of a supercomputer compared to its predecessors. However, even in the beginning, Grumman had big plans for the fledgling turkey. An important addition came from when the Navy was still requiring visual identification of enemy aircraft for a missile shot. During the Vietnam War, identification friend or foe was a new tool used by American aircraft, which would allow the crew of, say, an F-4 to determine if the aircraft they were tracking on radar was friendly or a bandit. As I discussed in my F-4 video, this is still pretty early on for the technology, and to prevent friendly fire, Phantom crews had to get up close to ID a target visually before pulling the trigger. The initial solution to the problem came from early F-15 crews in the late 1970s, who began bringing privately purchased rifle scopes on flights to extend their visual range from 3 to 6 miles. During the 1979 USS America cruise, F-14 Tomcat pilots who caught wind of the trick asked the Navy to supply VF-213 Black Lions with a batch of scopes. The Navy supply system, misunderstanding the request, instead sent the Black Lions a scope, or 144 pairs, of reading glasses. That's when John Hawk Smith of the squadron had his father send him over a 3x9 Weaver scope from home. The 3x9 scope allowed Hawk to identify a MiG-sized aircraft at about 7 miles, greatly improving the identification range. Testing with the scope proved so successful that all fighter squadrons based in Miramar, California were authorized to purchase rifle scopes for their crews. Grumman soon came up with a more permanent solution. Working with Northrop, who developed the Tizio system for the Air Force F-4s, a new chin pod was developed for the Tomcat. Slung beneath the AUG-9 radar antenna, the new camera, dubbed AXX-1 television camera system, could reliably identify aircraft at 10 miles. The closed-circuit television would display the camera's feed on the pilot's upper screen, known as the VDI. Not only could the camera see straight ahead, it could slew about per the Rio control inputs, and it could also be slave to the AUG-9 radar. Instead of locking a target at long range and IDing up close with the aforementioned scope, the TCS could instantly snap to the radar contact. TCS footage could even be recorded onto a tape in the F-14 for later viewing. This was useful for rudimentary reconnaissance, getting a close-up look at the best bear bomber, or even capture lessons from mock dogfights. TCSs were retrofitted to the F-14A, and later came standard on the F-14B and the F-14D Super Tomcat. Speaking of reconnaissance, another tool that came into the F-14 was the TARPS, or the Tactical Airborne Reconnaissance Pod System. Before the TARPS pod, the US Navy maintained a fleet of dedicated recon aircraft like the RF-8 Crusader and the RA-5 Vigilante, both of which served alongside the new CAT on the carrier deck. By the mid-1980s, however, the aging recon birds were being phased out in favor of the new TARPS pod. Now, just because it wasn't a dedicated recon bird didn't mean the F-14 wasn't a good set of eyes for the fleet. The 1,850-pound TARPS pod was fitted to the rear Phoenix space in the Tomcat's gutter and required a bit of modification to work. The TARPS pod was fitted with a multitude of cameras. The forward bay had a 150mm serial frame camera on a rotating mount that could point straight down or up at 45 degrees forward. The middle section housed the KA-99 panoramic camera that swiveled to the port and starboard positions of the F-14 for side photos. Finally, the rear section of the pod carried an infrared line scanner camera for nighttime photography. The TARPS pod was extremely successful, allowing battle damage assessments and threat analyses for future missions. A notable early use of the TARPS pod was to survey air defenses in the Bekaa Valley during the 1983 Lebanon strikes as part of El Dorado Canyon. Limitations in the KA-99 required the Tomcats to fly as low as 10,000 feet above the Sam Redden Valley, prompting a program to upgrade the pod's capabilities. In 1984, the Navy upgraded the TARPS with the KA-93 910mm long-range optic, which allowed future TARPS missions to be flown at safer altitudes. Wouldn't you know, the TARPS even helped people back in the States. In the 1993 Mississippi River flood, FEMA put in a request for the Navy to fly TARPS missions over the affected areas to determine the amount of damage caused. Hell, a friggin' TARPS mission was flown during the Waco siege, which... well, okay, I'm not gonna really get into that today. Even in the 1970s, the US Navy sought to replace the TF-30 engine that I talked about last episode. If you haven't seen it, check it out here. The short and skinny of it is that it was a turbofan intended for the F-111B, which had issues at high angles of attack and resulted in quite a few Tomcat losses. John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy, was quoted as saying this of the TF-30 and Tomcat combination: "Probably the worst engine-airframe mismatch we've had in years." So yeah, they needed an upgrade. Early tests with the Pratt & Whitney F401 engines were promising, but the engine never saw widespread adoption by the Navy due to budgetary issues. In 1986, however, the F-14A+, later dubbed F-14B, came online, having been equipped with the GE F-110 turbofan. The F-110 was originally designed for use in the Air Force's F-15 and F-16 fleet to create an improved and more universal engine for the branch. The Navy's version, the F-110 GE400, offered better reliability and performance, but it too had some teething issues to overcome. Early F-14Bs were reported to disintegrate or just flat out explode suddenly during high-speed flights. The new engines were found to be literally burning through their liners and into the airframe, resulting in total destruction of the aircraft. Once the problem was isolated, however, it was a pretty simple move to improve the engine liners, and a mere 6 months after a 1993 VF-124 Tomcat breakup, all F-14s were renovated and the problem ceased. The F-110 proved to be and still is an extremely reliable engine, and was the backbone of the latter half of the Tomcat's career. Still, the Tomcat was to get even better. The addition of the TCS and F-110, along with a new digital flight control system and improved avionics, culminated in the F-14D Super Tomcat. The Super Tomcat was a whole new bird, fitted with modern multifunction displays, a new heads-up display, and even an integrated infrared search and track pod. The IRST, fitted alongside the TCS pod, offered greater situational awareness for the crew and could track targets at long range without the need to blast radar waves out the nose, which would in turn highlight the Tomcat. I'll be honest, a lot of the IRST's capabilities and functionality are still classified, and it was a one-of-a-kind capability for Western aircraft. On that note, F-22s are slated to receive IRST pods only now, almost 20 years after the last F-14D took to the air. The Super Tomcat also received a digital flight control system, which helped the pilot fly in conditions that would otherwise leave the F-14 in a spin or worse. Think of it as a limiter. Whereas earlier F-14s allowed the pilot to input commands that would throw the plane into a departure or put increased strain on the airframe during high-G maneuvers, the DFCS would take said inputs and only allow safe operation through the flight surfaces. The old 1960s era heads-up display was also quite antiquated by the 1990s. In short, you got a few numbers, some lines, and a dot. F you. The Navy replaced it with a similar HUD to that in the F-18. Important indications like speed, altitude, etc., previously relegated to steam gauges, were right up in the pilot's face. The Rio pit was overhauled as well. Modern multifunction displays and digital screens replaced the old fishbowl that once displayed radar and other important data. The post-Cold War Tomcat squadrons also received the ability to carry the Lantern Designator pod that allowed them to drop laser-guided bombs. By the end of its career, the Tomcat was a true multi-role platform, able to do everything from reconnaissance, air-to-air intercepts, and could put a pave-weight guided bomb through a window from 20,000 feet. Hell, even anti-radiation and anti-ship missiles were tested on the Tomcat, but they never made it to the fleet. What came with the end of the Cold War was a lesser need for a Cold War fleet defense fighter, however, and only 55 Super Tomcats were built or converted from old A stocks. So what about the rest of the 500 or so F-14s? Even F-14As and Bs of the fleet received numerous upgrades. The DFCS, repeated set, and lantern capabilities were applied to much of the fleet. An off-the-shelf HUD improvement came for legacy Tomcats in the form of the Sparrowhawk, based directly on the HUD in the F-18. Tomcats across the fleet also received the ALR-67 radar warning receiver in the 1990s. The 67 was a huge step up from the Vietnam-era ALR-45. The old 45 set was tuned to very specific Soviet surface-to-air missiles, and often resulted in aircrews purchasing off-the-shelf radar scanners to help with identifying other kinds of threats. All this aside, due to budget cuts, there were still some old F-14As serving into the 2000s alongside their upgraded counterparts. Some airframes received certain upgrades and missed others. Oftentimes, there were no two Tomcats exactly alike in Navy squadrons. VF-211 rocked some of the oldest Tomcats in the fleet, still with their TF-30 engines until 2004 when they transitioned to Super Hornets. That leaves us with the end of the F-14's career. You're probably thinking, why? Why was the best fighter ever turned into scrap metal? I know. It's a hard thing to digest, but I have a short answer and a long answer for you. The short answer is Dick Cheney, but the long answer is a bit more nuanced. The military is always looking for cost-cutting measures. With the end of the Cold War and the risk of bombers hitting the fleet disappearing, the Navy didn't see a need to maintain a fleet of heavy, expensive fighters. The F-A-18 Hornet family, with all its quirks aside, was a true multi-role package. It could dogfight, it could perform maritime strike, and it did it all for cheaper than the F-14. I'm not going into the exact hours or maintenance each plane needed or anything, but the newer F-18 was a hell of a lot easier to maintain than the old variable geometry platform. With the erasure of the long-range bomber threat and a lack of countries with fighters causing problems for us, it honestly made a bit of sense at the time to have this new multi-role platform and its upgraded Super Hornet evolution to take over the job of the F-14. For almost 30 years, we haven't had a near-peer threat that would warrant something doing the job of the Tomcat, and while hindsight is 20/20, the Navy's decision to sunset the F-14 in 2006 didn't come out of nowhere. Granted, the F-14 was slated for further upgrades in the form of the Tomcat 21. This would have included integration of the AMRAAM missile series and further modernizations, but why would the Navy have wanted to go this route when the new Super Hornet already had AMRAAMs and Gucci tools like Link 16 and AESA radar? Not to mention, Vice President Dick Cheney had it out for Northrop Grumman, but that's a whole other bag of worms. It pains me to say this, it really does, but I understand why the F-14 was retired. Even if it stayed in service beyond 2006, there is no way in hell it would still be around. Supposed stealth upgrades that aviation enthusiasts like to latch onto were and still are a pipe dream. The Tomcat was finally put to bed on September 22, 2006. Of course, we weren't the only ones to have Tomcats. The Imperial Iranian Air Force purchased 79 F-14s from the US in the mid-1970s, only for them to fall into the hands of an American enemy when the Ayatollah came to town in 1979. While support for their F-14s was cut off after the revolution, the Iranian Air Force has done a surprisingly good job at maintaining their fleet and is the main reason most of the US Navy F-14s were scrapped in the 2000s, lest the Iranians get their hands on a flow of parts. Details on Iranian Tomcats aren't as clear-cut as their American brethren. They've been upgraded to carry the indigenous Fakor missile, which was based on the Phoenix, and there are even photos of the old fighters packing Hawk surface-to-air missiles. Even so, the 50-year-old airframes are due to be replaced by Russian-built Su-35s in the coming years. It won't be long until the last F-14 in the world takes its last flight. The Tomcat has a hell of a history, and while it is a thing of the past, it still captivates those who look upon it. I love this plane. It was the naval fighter of the latter half of the 20th century and laid the groundwork for the future of air warfare. As we find ourselves looking at the possibility of peer enemies threatening the carrier battle group, the job of the Tomcat is now relevant as it was in the Cold War. The F-A-18 has been upgraded to carry the AIM-174B, a new beyond visual range missile that would have brought a tear to the Tomcat's eye. With a range of at least 130 miles, it has revived the capability once lost in the Tomcat's wake. The new FAXX program for the Navy is sure to invoke memories of the Tomcat's past. with a capability jump not seen since the Phantom drivers were able to transition to the F-14 in the 70s. Who knows? Maybe we'll see Grum and Cats return to the decks of aircraft carriers someday. Thanks for watching, and of course we have more Tomcat history coming up, so don't forget to subscribe, and if you like the video, please leave me a like. It really does help me out. On that note, if you really want to help me out, consider joining my Patreon. It grants you special Discord access, the occasional art assets you see in these videos, and more. This wouldn't be a video of mine unless I mentioned my amazing patrons who keep the wheels turning around here. I couldn't do without you guys. Special thanks to my Ace of Aces tier, Captain Fantastic, Deuce, Ghoul, Iron, Jake Fuentes, Kodai, Pecops, Private Petey, Aspen, Tico, Weefy, Boats FG, Blake Stormelite, and Pecops. You guys really are the GOAT. Is that being used properly? Is that what you guys are saying now? Whatever. Keep that sun on your back now. Have a good one. Hello?
Falcon, get up.
Pig, it's 4 in the morning.
Well, that's your fault for being born in a country on the wrong side of the fucking planet. Listen, I am sick of these people demanding an F-111 video. All I hear every day is Vark. When is the Vark coming out? When you doing the Vark? No.
So why not just pump one out?
No. You are the plane boy. You know the funny planes, funny American boy. Get your ass on it!
Alright, give me a sec. That's right, we're talking about the F-111, guys. Now this thing is pretty controversial. And by controversial, I mean to say that if you know what you're talking about, you probably love this plane and appreciate the technological innovations for the day it had. If you're of the reformer mindset or work for an overhyped corpo YouTube channel trying to rage bait people, then you're wrong. Look, I used to be a skeptic of the F-111 when I was an edgy teenager too, but when I started digging into the capabilities of this bad boy, I was convinced. The Aardvark was an awesome piece of American aviation. So good that even the Australians loved it.
In the next century, when today's military aircraft are evaluated by future historians, this one may be rated as the best for its task ever designed.
Let's rewind the clock. The F-111's origins can be found in the early days of the Cold War. Back then, you had a multitude of different aircraft tailored to specific duties. You had fighters like the F-86 or F-104 meant to tangle with other fighters, interceptors such as the F-94 or F-102 meant to tackle bombers, and then you had fighter bombers which were, well, less meant to fight other aircraft and instead make high-speed, low-altitude runs to deliver bombs. These weren't like heavy bombers which were large and meant to strike from high altitude, but smaller aircraft that scaled well with their air-to-air brethren. The whole reason fighter bombers like the F-105 came about was to deal with an increased threat in the form of Soviet surface-to-air defenses. During World War II, Nazi Germany experimented with guided rockets intended to shoot down bombers. However, it was in the post-war era that you started to see more intricate designs intended to work in conjunction with radar-guided AA artillery. The United States was concerned that the Soviet Union would be heavily defended should a nuclear strike be ordered, and by the 50s, the Soviets had developed a vast air defense network not seen before. Among the threats to American bombers were Soviet KS-19s, 100mm cannons able to engage targets above 40,000 feet with their SAW-9 fire can radars. In addition, by 1956, Moscow was ringed by S-25 Berkuts, also known as SA-1 Guild missiles by NATO. The first-generation Soviet surface-to-air missiles were static, but a massive threat to B-36 peacemakers should they have to strike Russian cities. The next year, the S-75 Dvina, or SA-2 Guideline, was deployed in the Soviet Union. The Guideline could be moved via trucks and set up in areas where the SA-1 couldn't. The SA-2 was a two-stage missile that could reach over 80,000 feet. In a very Soviet move, the SA-2 was widely dispersed to warpack nations as well as Communist China. The threat became real on October 7, 1959, when a Taiwanese RB-57 Canberra was flying a reconnaissance mission over Beijing. There, it was shot down by a Guideline. The SA-2's true capabilities were shown off less than a year later on May 1, 1960, when a U-2 spy plane flown by Francis Gary Powers was shot down at over 60,000 feet. The Guideline crew also shot down one of their own MiG-19s during their attempted intercept, but the point still stood. Surface-to-air missiles were a true threat for aircraft flying at any altitude. Flying high was just not enough. Around this time, the US Air Force had been developing tactics for a low-altitude interdiction mission, the thought being that if a bomber flew low enough, it would be impervious to radar locks with all the terrain clutter around it. Needless to say, when we became embroiled in Vietnam, this theory was heavily challenged. Navy A-6 and Air Force F-105 crews were rudely surprised when SA-2s were easily able to lock onto them at near treetop level, even at night. So what was the solution? Get even lower and even faster. The US Air Force wanted a new low-altitude interdiction aircraft, even as the F-105 was coming online in the late 1950s. In addition to shortcomings with the actual penetration duty, fielding such aircraft required long runways as swept-wing fighters of the day had high takeoff and landing speeds. A straight-winged aircraft would allow for a lower takeoff and landing speed and reduce the need for long runways. At the same time, though, such a plane wouldn't be able to get up to speed for supersonic strikes. In June of 1960, the Air Force put out specification SOR-183 for a high-speed interdiction and strike aircraft, capable of an 800-mile range. Its low-level run-in speed was to be no less than Mach 1.2, but also feature short takeoff and landing capabilities. This is around the same time the US Navy was looking for a replacement for its F-4 Phantom for fleet defense duty. They needed a plane with a long loiter time, a high top speed for intercepting bombers, and also allow for lower landing speeds. So why not make a plane that could do both jobs? SecDef Robert McNamara strolled up with his concept for an inter-service aircraft platform that could share the same general fuselage, engines, and offer other parts commonality. It's because of him around this time that you start seeing mass adoption of the same boots, uniform patterns, and weaponry among the four branches of the US military. When it comes to planes, that's when you start running into issues because, on paper, having the same airframe tailored to each service's needs sounds great. And in modern times, it's definitely more feasible. Back in the 1960s, however, it was a lot more complicated. McNamara issued the Tactical Fighter Experimental Program to aircraft designers to try and make a universal aircraft that could do the jobs normally covered by half a dozen planes. General Dynamics, once an electric boat manufacturer in the 20th century, had by the late 50s merged with the Canadair and Convair aircraft companies. Competing with Boeing, they put forward a proposal for a TFX Sentry, an extremely large, twin-engined aircraft. Their ace in the hole was implementing a new wing concept: variable geometry. In order to offer high speed, the wing was designed to sweep back, then shift forward to a straight configuration for takeoff and landing. The two-man crew were seated side by side in an escape capsule, which was seen as a safer ejection method at high speed. General Dynamics' bid was chosen over Boeing's by McNamara in 1962 as it offered more parts commonality between the Air Force and Navy variants, and was soon dubbed F-111. The F-111 was a massive aircraft. At 74 feet, 6 inches long, it was 2 inches longer than a World War II-era B-17 Flying Fortress. The new design was powered by a pair of massive Pratt & Whitney TF-30 turbofan engines with a combined thrust of over 50,000 pounds with afterburner. The F-111B was intended for carrier use and had a shorter nose to allow easier storage on a busy deck, and was fitted with the same AUG-9 fire control system as seen in the later F-14. And yes, it was meant to carry the AIM-54 Phoenix missile. Unfortunately, the F-111B was just too damn big to operate safely from carrier decks. The decision was made in 1968 to cancel the naval variant of the F-111 and focus on the Air Force A model. The first production F-111s arrived in Air Force squadrons in July 1967. Now, there were 3 main lines of Air Force models produced through the lifetime of the aircraft. The F-111A was intended for tactical air command for conventional low-altitude strike missions. The F-111A's avionics suite was made up of the General Electric AN/APQ-113 attack radar fixed to a Texas Instruments APQ-110 terrain-following radar in the nose cone. The terrain-following radar displayed incoming terrain to the crew and was even mated to the automatic flight control system. The advanced setup allowed the pilot to fly hands-off at high speeds down to 200 feet. Texas Instruments, the champion of terrain-following radar and pocket calculators. The A model could deploy over 31,000 pounds of bombs from its internal bay. Everything from Mark 82 freefall bombs to Blue 107 Durandal cratering bombs were carried by the F-111 through its career. The other Aardvark, the FB-111, was deployed by the Strategic Air Command. The FB-111 differed from the TAC variant in that it had a longer wingspan and modified aft section to better facilitate carrying nuclear weapons. Fuel capacity was expanded for longer missions, and stronger landing gear allowed for heavier takeoff and landing weights, Later versions of the FB-111 could also carry the AGM-69 Short-Range Attack Missile, or SRAM. That packed a W-69 warhead with a yield of 200 kilotons. As a replacement for the B-58 Hustler, the FB-111 was on standby for the nuclear mission that luckily never came. Now, there was a third F-111 variant called the EF-111 Raven, which involved refitting F-111As with electronic warfare equipment. These came in the late 60s as a replacement for the Douglas EB-66 destroyer and would become the backbone of tactical electronic warfare formations into the 90s. It's important to know that the F-111 never received an official nickname from the US Air Force, but the moniker Aardvark stuck in reference to its long nose. And I can see the resemblance. As Aardvark is Afrikaans for Earth Pig, another name for the 111 was simply the Pig. The F-111A was first deployed in combat in March 1968 with the 474th Tactical Fighter Wing. The wing, intended to trial the new aircraft in combat, conducted 55 night sorties in Southeast Asia, but there was a huge problem. 2 F-111s were lost to unknown causes. The Air Force continued operating the aircraft despite the losses, attributing their disappearances to ground fire, but the real answer came on April 22nd when aircraft 66-0024 suffered a failure of a hydraulic control valve for the horizontal stabilizer. The failure caused an uncommanded pitch up, which departed the aircraft and resulted in a crash. All F-111 combat operations were immediately halted until a remedy was found. The second deployment of the F-111 in Vietnam was much more successful. As part of Operation Linebacker 2, Aardvarks conducted over 4,000 combat sorties with only 6 aircraft being lost. The Aardvark was loved for its low-altitude strike capabilities, and a single Pig could carry the same bomb load as 4 Phantoms. Thanks to the massive fuel load, they could strike from their bases in Thailand without needing to refuel, which was another massive perk of the plane. After Vietnam, the F-111 continued to serve with immense success. On a 13-hour mission from RAF Lakenheath, F-111s escorted by EF-111 Ravens struck targets in Libya during the 1986 El Dorado Canyon raid. The Aardvark's crowning achievement was yet to come, however, in the 1991 Gulf War.
Three, two,
My position
1,
for about 10
should be impact.
Boom! Oh, yes!
Coming right.
The Gulf War is still one of the most successful implementations of air power in history. Almost every type of military aircraft took part in the gargantuan operation, and of course, the F-111 did its part. By now, the F-111 was upgraded to the F model, which had upgraded TF-30 engines, a strengthened wing box, and could even mount the AVQ-26 PaveTac laser designator. The designator allowed the Aardvark to carry laser-guided bombs, adding precision strike to the aircraft's resume. Before thrusting his forces into Iraq, General Norman Schwarzkopf wanted the Air Force and Navy to plan for at least half of all Iraqi armored vehicles to be destroyed from the air. In December 1990, the exercise Operation Night Camel, they really called it that? Okay. Night Camel was conducted with various aircraft mounting precision-guided weapons. The operation found that flying from a medium altitude allowed for the best envelope to identify, laze, and bomb a vehicle-sized target. This was a departure from the F-111's modus operandi. Normally flying at medium altitude put the Aardvark at risk of anti-aircraft defenses, but a Night 1 strike to disable Iraq's command and control and SAMs in a decapitation strike would make subsequent bombing missions more feasible. A 4-ship formation of Aardvarks packing laser designators and GBU-12 paveways was the winning combination. A term for striking targets in this matter was coined by the pilots: tank plinking. This wasn't well received by Stormin' Norman in an exchange with General Chuck Horner that went something like this. Tell them to not call it tank plinking. That's the surest way to get them to call it tank plinking. Throughout the short and violent Persian Gulf War, F-111s alone counted for 80% of precision munitions dropped in combat. Now, you all know the A-10 Warthog is often called the tank buster, and it did the job well enough. It nailed 900 armored vehicles in the conflict while losing 6 aircraft. The F-111 knocked out 1,500, which was about a quarter of Iraq's 6,000 or so inventory in 1991. All without losing a single plane. So why is that? As Iraq's strategic air defenses, including their SA-2s, were mainly destroyed early on in the war, it allowed safe medium-altitude operations free from smaller air defense assets like manpads and AA guns. A-10s, on the other hand, had to get low to hit their targets, which put them well in line of fire of the shoulder-launched SAMs and such. Granted, A-10s weren't really on hunter-killer missions like the F-111 and were primarily acting in a close air support capacity, both of which are completely different jobs. That being said, there was one EF-111 Raven lost in the war when it hit the ground attempting to evade an Iraqi fighter. On the flip side, another EF-111 had the opposite effect, driving a Mirage F-1 into the ground that was chasing it with the help of an F-15 Eagle. All in all, the Persian Gulf War was the conflict that silenced the critics, and while its contributions have largely been forgotten in recent years, it really was the backbone of the coalition's tank-busting efforts. Of course, all good things have to come to an end. One of the big faults of the Aardvark was that it was expensive to maintain. In the mid-1990s, the F-111 was retired in favor of more modern aircraft like the F-16 that could do the same job in a smaller, more cost-effective package. However, its story wasn't quite finished yet.
The Royal Australian Air Force now has a plane that has a strike capability that will be available to this country for a long time.
Did you say how long, sir?
It would certainly be flying well into the 80s and probably beyond that.
While the F-111 was shopped around to various countries including the UK, the Australian Air Force was the only other adopter of the Pig. In the 1960s, the Australian government sought a replacement for their Asian Canberra bombers and eyed the new fighter as early as 1963. There are a lot of Australian politics involved in the selection process, and I'm gonna gloss over that as I'm a silly American, but I suggest reading up on it. There was even a consideration for the US to loan Australia a B-47 squadron in the interim, but that was decided against given it wasn't that much of a jump from the Canberra in capability. The F-111C was a specialized variant developed for the Australian Air Force, combining the airframe of the A model with the longer wings and hardened landing gear of the FB-111. Initially, the order for the first batch of 24 aircraft was to arrive in 1968, however delays prompted the US to lend Australia 24 F-4 Phantoms until the Aardvarks could be delivered. Finally, after 5 years, the first F-111C was turned over to the Royal Australian Air Force at Nellis Air Force Base on March 5th, 1973. The Aussies used their pigs for almost 40 years to great effect, and although it never saw combat, it was a force to be reckoned with in the South Pacific. Nothing for 1,000 miles could outrun her, outfly her, or carry a larger payload. Oh, and this is some crazy shit. So, the F-111 has a fuel dump port between her engines. As the fuel is expended, it could then be ignited by lighting off the afterburners. US pilots were told strictly not to do this, but the boys down under made the dump and burn a staple of F-111 airshow demos. Like, this has no actual combat usage, but it is one of the coolest things I've seen an old fighter bomber do. While they were replaced by F-A-18s in 2010, the F-111C is still an Australian icon. Not bad for a Yankee-built plane, I'd say.
She's Yankee-built, sir.
It's honestly a shame we haven't seen more F-111 action in media because it really is an underrated plane from a historical standpoint. Let's see, they show up in Red Dawn attacking Soviet armored columns. It's in the Angry Video Game Nerd movie. Oh, there's this cool Dale Brown book called Iron Wolf where F-111s operated by a PMC are upgraded with F-22 avionics. That's a cool idea. Oh, right. In 1965, James Rosenquist painted an 86-foot-long image of an F-111 as a statement against Vietnam and consumerism, I think. I don't know. It looks hard, though. Regardless of a big media presence, the F-111 was a huge step in strike aircraft design and laid the groundwork for future planes like the F-15E Strikey.
Falcon!
Wait, who the hell?
Get in the Vark, Falcon! Get in the Vark! Falcon! We're gonna go fly the Vark, Falcon! Get some chemicals
Falcon,
in the
get in
wings.
the damn
We're gonna go to Moscow! Gonna go turn it into a green cube!
Alright, I'm in. Thanks for watching, guys, and of course, here comes the patron roll. These guys are the ones who keep my wallet lined just enough to continue making content. I can't tell you how much it means to be able to do this. Special thanks to Captain Fantastic, Deuce, Ghoul, Iron, Jake Fuentes, Kodai, Private Petey, Aspen, Weefy, Boats FG, Strider1, Vox2, and Caleb Corey. I also want to remind you guys that I'm still working with Karl for Ukraine to hook up the 129th Lahit unit with a truck to support their future drone operations. If you're able to help out even a little, it will go to an awesome cause and help them keep pushing back the Russian invaders. That being said, keep that sun on your back, gang. Have a good one.
Falcon, they're outside my door again. I can hear them. They're just, they want me to do the F-111 video again. I don't know. They just keep running at me. Keep running. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but they just keep doing it. They got the time. F-111, the fuck thing with the fuck.